Can Greek gods actually die? So to answer that question, first I want to talk about the gods' bodies. Because when we look at their depictions, even the really old ones, they seem perfectly normal. They look human, and Homer already showed how they were very humanized beings with feelings and desires just like the rest of us. But what about inside that body? Were there organs? Was there blood? The answer to those two questions is yes, and kind of. Let's start with the organs, because we actually have several references to the gods' internal organs. Right off the bat, I remember Prometheus's liver. It's widely mentioned in that story where the eagle comes by every day to have a little snack in there. Several authors specifically mention the liver, starting with our buddy Hesiod. And the gods' genital organs are also mentioned. We definitely know they had them, except for Uranus. Because, well, you know. And we also know that the gods breathed a special kind of air, the ether. It was one of the three types of air, the celestial one, the higher kind. The one that surrounded the mountain peaks, the clouds, the stars, the sun, and the moon. And therefore Mount Olympus. If the gods breathe, then they must have lungs too, right? Can we count the brain because of Athena's birth? Probably. But either way, Zeus's brain is actually mentioned by Homer himself in that episode with Hypnos. It says Hypnos made Zeus's brain fall asleep. And Cronus's stomach is also mentioned a few times as the prison where he kept his children. So, Greek gods are the most human gods you're going to find out there. So yes, they had organs just like we do. What they didn't have was blood. Or kind of. What flows through the gods' veins is an ethereal fluid known as ichor, and it's golden. When a god is wounded, instead of blood, ichor drips from the injury, which is what makes them immune to death. It's a sacred substance capable of retaining the properties of Olympus's food and drink, ambrosia and the nectar of the gods, which is exactly what makes the gods immortal. But then that brings up a second question. What would happen if a god were cut off from those divine foods? Could they die in that case? Technically no. But there is a story that shows they can get pretty close to it. It happened after the gigantic Elodie attacked Olympus. Ares tried to go head-to-head with them, but he ended up chained, trapped, and captured. More than that, he was taken hostage. Poor Ares spent 13 months stuffed inside a bronze jar, a pithos, without the precious nectar of the gods, which is what would have kept him strong and alive. That could have been the end of the god of war. But then Hermes showed up to save the day. Ares was rescued in a state of extreme weakness, thin and almost unrecognizable. But he wasn't dead and probably wouldn't die. He'd likely just stay in that near-death vulnerable state until he was fed again. But there's another story that makes all of this even clearer. It's the Orphic myth of Zagreus, the son of Zeus and Persephone. The boy was literally torn to pieces, devoured by the Titans. And then, while still inside the Titans' bodies, he was struck down by Zeus, who came to take revenge. Even after all that, Zagreus remained alive. Just a small part of him. Some say it was the heart that was rescued. And from that heart, Dionysus was born, who was basically Zagreus reborn. Dionysus himself, when he was still in his mother's womb, this time Semele, also survived the explosion that killed her. If he hadn't been Zeus's son, the fetus would have been gone for sure. Instead, he kept growing inside his father's thigh. So basically the guy died like 3 times, but just kept going, strong as ever. That's why I say he's the most powerful of Zeus's children. So that's it. The gods can't die, even if Kratos might say otherwise. Which leads us to an unexpected question. In that case, what would be the end of Greek mythology? The Greeks had a more optimistic view, if we can call it that. To them, the world would always be there no matter what happened. They were definitely afraid of death and destruction. They didn't even dare speak Hades' name out loud. But they believed their gods were eternal and powerful. Very different from the Norse, who not only accepted mortality, but knew that even the greatest gods would eventually fall. But look, even though there isn't exactly a world-ending story, Greek mythology kind of has an ending, and that ending is the Trojan War and the Odyssey. Not because the world ends there, but because after those stories, there just aren't any more myths. No more heroes, no more quests, no more monsters to be slain. There are some later events, but nothing too epic. It's as if the race of humans that gave rise to all those legendary heroes had finally died out. And the current race, the one that now worships those same heroes, just isn't as gifted, as powerful, or as blessed as the ones before. The sequel to those stories would be the Aeneid, but that's already Roman mythology, created to give Rome a mythical past. If I'm not mistaken, it was a story commissioned by Emperor Augustus, who wanted a myth that could surpass the works of Homer. And so Virgil came up with the tale of Aeneas and the founding of Rome. Hesiod tells us that the history of mankind is divided into 5 ages, from the Golden Age to the Silver Age, then to the Bronze, passing through the Age of Heroes and finally arriving at the Iron Age, considered the worst of them all. In Hesiod's own words, "I wish I had not been born among the men of the 5th race." He even talks about the departure of Eidos and Nemesis, who leave the world behind to join the immortal gods on Olympus. In other words, the end times would come when humanity becomes so disrespectful and dishonorable that even the gods of shame and divine retribution, Eidos and Nemesis, give up trying to instill any virtue in people. So the world and the universe would go on existing forever, because the universe itself is eternal, but the things within it are not. Nothing can survive as long as the universe itself. Eventually, through their own actions, humankind would be erased from existence, even though their gods and the universe around them would remain relentless for all eternity. Now, the more knowledgeable fans of Greek mythology might be asking, but what about Pan? Did he die or not? Well, for that we need to go back to the Greek historian Plutarch. According to him, the only Greek god who actually died was Pan. It supposedly happened during the reign of Tiberius in the 1st century AD. So a later myth, one that would have taken place after the Trojan War. The story talks about a sailor, supposedly named Themis, who was on his way to Italy. As he passed by the Greek island of Paxi, he heard a divine voice. And that voice asked him to proclaim to the people that the great god Pan is dead. So that's exactly what he did when he arrived at the port. It said the announcement was met with groans and mourning, and the news spread quickly. Early Christian writers interpreted the story as happening around the same time as the death of Christ. So Pan's death would symbolize the transition from a pagan world to a Christian one, burying the old gods and their influence once and for all. In other words, the death of the great god Pan would actually mean the death of all the gods, especially since the Greek word for all is literally Pan. Not coincidentally, the figure of Pan, the Greek god with horns and goat legs, went on to inspire the Christian image of the devil in art and literature. But this supposed death of Pan only appears in Plutarch's writings. No other ancient source mentions it. In fact, when Pausanias traveled through Greece about a century later, he talked about sanctuaries and sacred caves still dedicated to Pan. He even described pilgrimages and rituals in Pan's honor, especially in Arcadia. So the most likely explanation is that there was some mistranslation or misinterpretation, and that the mysterious voice might have actually been referring to another god, Tammuz, a Mesopotamian deity who really did die.